Welcome to Unit 3, Mod 9. Today we are going to be talking about non-interpersonal trauma. Specifically, we're going to look at things like terrorism and natural disasters and how those are traumatic and our response to those types of trauma. So we're going to start with this question: what can I do? Thinking about terrorism, natural disaster, or non-interpersonal types of trauma. What can I do as a person, as a professional, maybe even as a victim? So from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, we have some guidelines to think about, especially as professionals. We need to remember that we are going to work. We are not going to tour. And that is really important because a large number of disasters are going to occur in places that have limited access to mental health services, and touring those places or traveling to those places may seem like an adventure, but when we're going to help, we're going to work. We also have to remember to be flexible. There's going to be chaos and unpredictability surrounding these types of disasters, and so those who are victimized, those who are traumatized by these things, are going to also have unpredictable responses and be living in that chaos. So we have to be flexible and within that. We need to be ethical. We need to remember the lessons that we have learned to uh, be prepared to do whatever is needed to do, but be ethical in doing that. We need to be trained. And this, from a professional standpoint, is pretty easy. We need to be trained in how we are to respond in disaster situations, in these traumatic situations. But I think one of the things that I would encourage those of you who are going to be family life educators, therapists, or social workers to think about is how we can begin broadly training our community to be prepared for disasters, especially thinking, I live here in Oklahoma, and so thinking about Oklahoma and the potential for tornadoes, having families prepared for that kind of disaster. Also, you'll see in a little bit, uh, Oklahoma City was the site of a terrorist attack that no one saw coming. And so, what have we learned from that, and how might we be prepared to deal with something unpredictable like that in the future as well? So I think there's definitely training that needs to be happening on the professional level, but as professionals, we also need to be thinking, how do we train the community at large for this type of non-interpersonal trauma that might occur? Well, here's some ideas: roles of helpers, some things that um, we might do as helpers in these traumatizing situations. We might assist emergency directions and coordination and mental health response. Remember, it's very easy to think about the physical response: Oklahoma City bombing, 9/11, lives lost, bodies maimed, those types of things, tornadoes. People, again, lives lost or people injured in natural disasters, those types of things. Easy to think about the physical, but we also need to remember the coordination efforts dealing with mental health of those who have survived and those who maybe were directly impacted, and maybe they lost not just a loved one, maybe they lost a home, maybe they lost a colleague, something like that. Helpers can also oversee safety, both mental and physical safety of other workers. And so we'll talk in the next module a lot about secondary trauma and self-care, those things that when we're in the midst of helping others with these kind of traumas, it's very easy for us to be traumatized as well. And so one of the ways that we can provide help is to make sure that there's safety, physical and mental safety, for other help there. We can inform other workers of appropriate screening, assessment, and intervention strategies. Again, this is a time for us to be prepared. So if we're well versed in where to go, what resources to tap into, we can help educate others in that as well. We can also conduct seminars and training opportunities right in the midst of that crisis and following that crisis and dealing with trauma and responses to trauma. And so those are very important things, especially after the crisis. We don't want to forget that there are still traumatized victims there. When working with non-interpersonal trauma, we have to consider our own health concerns, our own personal safety. Uh, to go to ground zero of the Oklahoma City bombing or of 9/11 or of uh, uh, Hurricane Katrina or other disasters like that is going to involve some environmental hazards. Gas lines could be ruptured, uh, glass could be all over the place, breathing in smoke, and just any kind of health hazard. We need to be aware of those. Um, we should um, attend organizational debriefings and screenings for any personal distress that we might have, especially during the exit procedure. Again, knowing our own health concerns, knowing our own limits, what can we deal with, and do we have someone or some way to debrief, to deal with our own processing of this trauma. We need to be aware of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. These are things we'll talk about more in the next module, but they are things that are very um, relevant to talk about and be aware of as we are working with trauma victims in these large disaster areas. It can be very easy for us to um, become traumatized ourselves, become burnt out, and definitely we need to be aware of that and take care of ourselves. So self-care is very important. Make sure that we are processing this trauma, talking, uh, working it out in groups or however that needs to happen. It's also important to know the 6 C's of disaster mental health. I think this is good for professionals, but it's also good as people, things that we can be educating people on to help them be prepared in the face of some kind of non-interpersonal trauma that might occur. The 6 C's are calmness. Trying to remain calm in chaos is difficult, but something that can be beneficial. Common sense, making common sense decisions, trying to be rational at a time where, especially traumatized victims, might be thinking very irrationally. Compassion, having compassion for those victims and having compassion for each other. Very important. Collaboration. Remember that these traumas are not solved individually. We work through these types of trauma together, and collaboration from all different kinds of areas, whether it's therapists or FLEs or social workers, hospital workers, child life specialists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. We're working together through this trauma. Communication is important. Communicating who you are, where you are, what you're doing, how you're doing, those types of things, very important for disaster mental health. And then control of self, gaining control of yourself in a time where control is felt to be gone. Things are felt to be out of my control. So getting control of myself. So knowing the 6 C's of disaster mental health, also very important. And in the midst of disaster, it is crucial to tend to the emotional needs of caregivers and disaster mental health professionals who are providing services, not just to those victims, but to those who are working with those victims. It's crucial to have mental health professionals implement and be a part of debriefings in multiple formats, individual, group, dyadic, etc. There may be any number of different formats, but we want everyone who is involved in this traumatic experience to be able to debrief from it. And then we want to encourage check-in visits with mental health professionals for victims and other professionals returning home after disaster relief. So there's follow-up there. We want to know what our triggers are. news stories, anniversary dates, those types of things, and be aware of those. We have to remember that non-interpersonal trauma is still trauma. It is traumatic, and I think sometimes we might be tempted to not equate the trauma that comes from maybe a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina or the more tornadoes or something like that with the trauma that comes from a sexual assault or child abuse uh, or war, something like that. And we have to realize that trauma is trauma, right? Trauma is trauma. So what I want you to do for this mod is obviously watch this lecture and download the PowerPoint, but then you're going to also watch a documentary about the OKC bombing, and you're going to read an excerpt from CNN regarding the Joplin tornado from several years ago. And then your Journal 9 response is going to be to that documentary and to that special report. And you'll be able to respond to those and just talk about what you saw, what you feel, and what you might do in those situations. So I hope that you will engage this module like you have the others. And in the next module, we'll talk about secondary trauma.